Margaret Hill had always believed that a house carried the memory of the people who lived inside it. The old two-story place on Maple Street still smelled faintly of cinnamon and furniture polish, just like it had when her husband Robert was alive. Every winter morning for nearly 35 years, she had brewed coffee in the same chipped mug and watched the steam rise while snow dusted the front yard. That morning, the house felt different. The kitchen clock ticked too loudly. The light coming through the window looked thin and pale, like it didn't want to stay. Margaret stood by the sink, holding a folded dish towel in her hands, listening to the sound of her daughter-in-law pacing in the living room. Laura Hill didn't pace when she was nervous. She paced when she was angry. "Daniel, you need to talk to her," Laura said, her voice sharp but controlled. "We can't keep pretending this is working." Margaret pretended not to hear. She dried a plate slowly, carefully, as if speed might break something. Daniel stood near the doorway, rubbing his forehead the way he always did when he felt trapped. He was 42 now, taller than his father had ever been. But when he looked at Margaret, he still had the same uncertain eyes he'd had as a boy. "Mom," he began. She turned to him, holding the plate against her chest. "Yes, honey?" There was a pause, a long one. Laura stepped into the kitchen. She crossed her arms, leaning against the counter like she had rehearsed this moment in her head 100 times. "We've talked about this," Laura said. "The house is too small. The kids need their own space. And honestly, Margaret, you don't really help around here anymore." Margaret blinked. The word "anymore" landed harder than the rest. "I do the laundry," she said quietly. "I cook when I can. I watch the kids after school." "And we appreciate that," Laura replied, though her tone didn't match the words. "But it's not the same. We're exhausted. We need privacy. We need our own life." Daniel swallowed. "Mom, maybe it's time you found somewhere else. Somewhere quieter, safer." Margaret looked around the kitchen. The yellow curtains she had sewn herself, the wooden table Robert had built with his own hands, the wall where she had measured Daniel's height every birthday. "Somewhere else," she repeated. Laura nodded. "Just for a while, until things settle." Margaret understood then that for a while meant forever. She went upstairs without another word. Her bedroom still held the shape of her life. A narrow bed, a dresser with loose handles, framed photos of birthdays and graduations. She opened the closet and took out her old suitcase, the brown one with the broken wheel. It hadn't been used since Robert's funeral. Her hands shook as she packed. 2 sweaters, a pair of wool socks, her winter coat, the photo of Robert in his fishing hat, the small Bible her mother had given her when she was a girl. She left behind most of her clothes, the blankets, the rocking chair by the window. When she came back downstairs, Daniel was waiting by the door. "I'll drive you somewhere," he said quickly. "We can look for a place, a motel, or—" Margaret lifted a hand. "No, honey, you don't need to." Laura stood near the staircase, already scrolling on her phone. Outside, the cold bit into Margaret's cheeks the moment she stepped onto the porch. The wind pushed dry snow across the yard in thin white lines. Winter had arrived early that year, and everyone in town felt it in their bones. Margaret paused at the front door. For a moment, she expected someone to stop her, to say they'd made a mistake. No one did. She pulled her coat tighter and walked down the steps. The bus stop was 3 blocks away. Her breath came out in soft clouds as she shuffled along the sidewalk, dragging her suitcase behind her. Cars passed, splashing slush onto the curb. No one looked twice at the small, gray-haired woman with the crooked suitcase. She got off near the edge of town, where the road narrowed and the houses thinned out. A few years earlier, Robert had rented a small storage shed behind an old mechanic's shop to keep his tools. After he died, no one had touched it. Margaret remembered the key. The shed sat crooked in the snow, its paint peeled down to bare wood. A rusted padlock hung from the door. She tried the key. It turned with a dull click. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold metal. A broken workbench leaned against the wall. Spider webs clung to the corners. Wind slipped through cracks in the boards. Margaret set down her suitcase and sat on an overturned bucket. "So this is home now," she whispered. That night, she wrapped herself in her coat and lay on the floor, staring at the dark ceiling. Every sound felt louder in the quiet. The whistle of wind, the creak of wood, the distant bark of a dog. She didn't sleep much. In the morning, she walked to the gas station and bought a cup of coffee with the last of her cash. The clerk glanced at her coat and her shaking hands. "You okay, ma'am?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "Just cold." By the 3rd day, people had noticed her. Mr. Collins from across the street saw her carrying grocery bags and shook his head. "You can't live in there, Margaret. Winter's coming." She nodded politely. I'll manage. Behind his back, someone muttered, she won't last. Margaret heard it. She always heard it. At night, she thought about knocking on Daniel's door. She imagined the warmth of the living room, the smell of dinner, the sound of the kids laughing. But she didn't go. Something inside her refused. Robert had once told her, if the world shuts the door, Maggie, build yourself another one. She didn't know how yet, but she would. That week, the first heavy snowstorm hit. Power went out in half the neighborhood. Pipes froze. People complained about heating bills and drafty windows. Margaret stood in her shed, watching snow pile up outside the door. Her fingers were numb. Her breath fogged the air. And for the first time since Laura's words in the kitchen, fear settled in her chest. Not fear of being alone, fear of not surviving the night. She sat on the floor and pressed her back against the wall. Lord, she whispered, I don't need comfort. I need a way. The wind howled through the cracks in the boards. Snow tapped against the roof like gravel. Margaret closed her eyes. Somewhere in her mind, a memory stirred. Of her childhood home in North Dakota. Of her mother lining the walls with newspaper and clay. Of nights when the stove went out, but the room stayed warm. Her heart beat faster. She stood up slowly. And for the first time since she had been pushed out into the cold, Margaret Hill felt something other than fear. She felt the faint, stubborn spark of an idea. By the time the idea fully took shape in Margaret Hill's mind, her fingers had gone stiff with cold. She stood inside the shed, staring at the warped wooden walls as if they might answer her back. The memory of her mother's voice, soft but firm, kept echoing in her head. Cold doesn't beat you if you don't let it steal your heat. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter and began to move. The shed was barely bigger than a single-car garage. The boards were thin, and the wind slid through the cracks like it had been invited. If she stayed the way things were, she knew what would happen. So she started with what she had. Behind the mechanic's shop was a pile of old cardboard boxes and torn insulation. Margaret dragged them inside one by one, stacking them along the walls. She found a bag of dry leaves and straw in a broken bin and stuffed them between the boards and the cardboard lining. Her hands ached, but she kept going. By noon, the shed looked less like a storage room and more like a strange patchwork cocoon. She pulled the broken workbench away from the wall and discovered a small metal stove underneath it. Rusted, but solid. It had once been used to melt grease for tools. The pipe had fallen apart, and there was no chimney, just a hole in the roof plugged with plywood. Margaret crouched beside it, brushing away dust. Well, she murmured, you and I might get along just fine. She walked to the thrift store and spent $5 on a cracked kettle and 2 wool blankets. At the hardware store, she bought clay filler meant for patching brick and a roll of cheap ducting. When she came back, her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was waiting by the fence. Margaret, she said, pulling her scarf tighter, you can't be serious about staying in that shack. You'll freeze out here. Margaret smiled gently. I won't. Mrs. Patterson hesitated. You could come stay with us for a night or two. Margaret shook her head. I appreciate it, but I need to do this my way. Mrs. Patterson sighed. You've always been stubborn. That's how I've always survived, Margaret replied. That afternoon, she worked until her back burned. She patched the roof with plastic she found in a trash bin and smeared clay filler into every visible crack. She fed the stove with broken pallets and branches she gathered from behind the store. Then she did something that made the men at the gas station laugh. She dug a shallow trench from the stove toward the back wall and fitted the ducting along it, sealing it with clay and tape. The hot air wouldn't shoot straight out anymore. It would have to travel. She leaned back on her heels and studied her work. It wasn't pretty, but it might hold warmth. That night, snow fell thick and fast. The shed creaked under its weight. Margaret lit the stove and watched the faint orange glow spread across the metal. She waited for the heat to vanish the way it usually did. It didn't. The walls stayed cool at first. Then, slowly, they began to feel less like ice and more like stone warmed by the sun. Margaret pressed her palm against the cardboard lining and closed her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, not sure who she was thanking. The next morning, she woke up with stiffness in her knees but no frost on her breath. The kettle was still warm enough to make tea. Outside, the world was white and silent. When she stepped out, Mr. Collins nearly dropped his coffee. You're alive, he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Was there doubt? He glanced at the shed. We figured you'd be on someone's couch by now. She smiled. Not yet. Word spread faster than she expected. People walked by the shed on their way to work, slowing their steps. Some shook their heads, others stared. That woman's living in a cardboard box, someone said. She'll be dead by Christmas, another muttered. Margaret heard it all. She spent her days improving the little shelter. She found old bricks behind the auto shop and stacked them around the stove to hold heat longer. She layered newspaper between the cardboard and the boards. She learned how to feed the fire slowly instead of letting it roar. Every evening, she sat on a crate and listened to the wind batter the walls. It didn't win. 3 days into the storm, the power went out across town. At Daniel's house, Laura stood in the dark kitchen with a flashlight, staring at the silent heater. "This is ridiculous," she said. "The kids are freezing." Daniel tried the breaker again. Nothing happened. "They said it might be days," he replied. Laura crossed her arms. "And your mother? She's still in that shed." Daniel's stomach tightened. He hadn't gone to see her. Not once. "We should check on her," he said. Laura hesitated. What if she's not okay?" They drove through the snow in silence. When they reached the back lot behind the mechanic's shop, Daniel's heart sank. The shed was still standing, half buried in snow. He ran to the door and knocked. "Mom?" The door opened. Warm air rushed out like a secret. Margaret stood there with a shawl around her shoulders and a mug in her hand. "Daniel," she said, surprised, "you look cold." He stared past her into the shed. The stove glowed gently. The walls looked thick, lined with layers of paper and cloth. "It's warm in here," he said. Laura stepped inside, eyes wide. "How?" Margaret gestured toward the stove and the ducting. "I made the heat take the long way." Laura's lips pressed together. For the first time since Margaret had left, she looked unsure. "We thought you wouldn't make it," Laura admitted. Margaret met her gaze calmly. "I thought so too." For a minute, silence filled the space. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the kettle whistled softly. Daniel swallowed. "Mom, you don't have to stay here." Margaret shook her head. "Not yet. I need to finish something." "What?" Laura asked. Margaret looked at the walls, at the stove, at the strange little shelter she had built with her own hands. "I need to prove to myself," she said, "that I can." When they left, Laura didn't laugh the way she used to. The storm deepened that night. Snow piled high against the doors of houses. The town went dark again. Margaret fed the stove slowly and lay under her blankets, listening to the soft crackle of wood. Fear tried to creep in, but something stronger pushed it back. She was no longer waiting to be rescued. She was building her way through winter. And somewhere inside her chest, beneath the layers of hurt and pride, a fragile sense of purpose began to grow. Not because she had been thrown out, but because she had stayed standing. The storm loosened its grip on the town, but winter did not. After Daniel and Laura left, Margaret sat alone in the shed and listened to the wind scrape along the walls. The little shelter smelled of smoke and damp cardboard, but it was warm enough that she could take off her gloves. She wrapped her hands around her mug and stared at the ducting she had sealed with clay and tape. "I made the heat take the long way," she had told Laura. The words stayed with her. That night she dreamed of her childhood home in North Dakota, a square little house with white siding and a coal stove that barely worked. Her mother had lined the walls with layers of newspaper and brushed clay between the boards every fall. When the fire went out at night, the room stayed warm long enough for them to sleep. Margaret woke before dawn with her heart pounding. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the thin structure around her, and whispered, "That's it." By mid-morning, she was back outside, digging through a pile of scrap behind the mechanic's shop. She found cracked bricks, bent metal sheets, and a bag of old roofing tiles. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She hauled everything inside and laid it around the stove, building a low wall of brick that wrapped halfway around it. Then she widened the trench she'd dug and added more ducting, guiding the warm air along the base of the walls before letting it escape through a small vent she cut near the roof. She mixed more clay filler and smeared it thick along the seams. Her back ached, her knees complained, but her mind felt sharp in a way it hadn't in years. When she lit the stove again, she didn't let it roar. She fed it slowly, small pieces of wood, steady and patient. The ducting grew warm. The bricks absorbed the heat. An hour later, she touched the wall. It wasn't hot, but it wasn't cold either. It felt alive. Margaret leaned her forehead against it and laughed softly. "You're working," she said, "aren't you?" That evening, Mrs. Patterson came by again, bringing a loaf of bread wrapped in a towel. "I saw you hauling bricks," she said. "Thought you might need this." Margaret invited her inside. The woman stepped through the door and stopped short. "Well, I'll be," she murmured. "It's warmer than my kitchen." Margaret smiled, proud and shy all at once. "The walls hold it now." Mrs. Patterson touched the lining with 2 fingers. "Feels like a church basement in summer." They sat on overturned crates and shared the bread with butter melted over the stove. Outside, the sun sank behind gray clouds. That night, the temperature dropped again. Pipes froze across town. A water main burst near Main Street. The radio warned people to stay indoors. Margaret lay under her blankets and waited for the cold to creep back in. It didn't. The walls released their stored warmth slowly, like they were breathing. She slept straight through until morning. Word traveled fast in a small town with nothing else to talk about. Did you hear about Margaret Hill? She's living in that old shed. And she's warm. Warm how? They say she lined the walls and made the heat travel around. That doesn't make sense. It does to her. At the gas station, men argued about it over coffee. Some said it was luck. Others said it was foolishness, dressed up as cleverness. Daniel heard the rumors and felt something twist in his chest. He went to see her again the next afternoon, alone this time. Margaret was kneeling on the floor, fitting another brick into place. "You're building a fortress now?" he asked gently. She looked up, surprised, then smiled. "More like a teacup. I just don't want the warmth spilling out too fast." He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The air wrapped around him, gentle and steady. "You shouldn't have to live like this," he said. Margaret wiped her hands on her coat. "I shouldn't have to beg either." Daniel's shoulders sagged. "Laura's scared. The kids were asking about you." "I know," Margaret replied. "But fear makes people do unkind things." He nodded slowly. "You always said that." She gestured to the walls. "This isn't about proving anything to her. It's about proving something to me." Daniel looked around. "That you can survive?" "That I can adapt," she corrected. "That I'm not finished yet." He stood in silence for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small bag of groceries. Canned soup, a loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter. "I thought you might need these." Margaret took the bag. "Thank you, honey." When he left, the shed felt larger somehow. Over the next few days, Margaret kept refining her strange little system. She added another layer of newspaper behind the cardboard. She adjusted the ducting so the warm air traveled farther before escaping. She learned how long to burn the stove to charge the walls. Each improvement made the nights easier. One afternoon, a young man from the hardware store stopped by. His name was Evan, and his hands were raw from splitting wood. "They say you figured out how to stay warm without burning half a forest," he said. Margaret laughed. "I still burn wood. I just don't waste the heat." He crouched beside the stove and studied the ducting. "My furnace went out. I've been sleeping in my coat." She hesitated, then pointed to the bricks. "You want to learn?" He nodded. She showed him how she layered the walls, how she guided the air, how she sealed the cracks. "It's not pretty," she said, "but it works." That night, Evan went home and tried something similar in his garage. The next morning, he came back grinning. It stayed warm till sunrise. Margaret felt a strange warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. People began stopping by, not in groups, but one at a time. A single mother with 2 kids, a retired truck driver with bad lungs, a man whose chimney had cracked in the cold. They didn't ask for shelter yet. They asked for answers. Margaret never turned anyone away. She didn't call it a system or a method. She called it making the heat behave. One evening, Laura drove past the shed on her way home from work. She saw the light inside and the faint curl of steam from the vent. For the first time, she slowed the car. She remembered Margaret's hands folding laundry, Margaret's voice reading to the kids, Margaret's quiet presence in the house. And she remembered telling her to leave. The guilt sat heavy in her stomach. That night, Laura said to Daniel, "She's doing better than I thought." Daniel didn't answer right away. "She always does." Outside, another storm gathered over the town. Margaret stood in her doorway and watched the clouds roll in. Snowflakes drifted down, slow and thick. She closed the door and fed the stove just enough to wake the walls. As the wind began to rise, she pressed her palm against the brick and felt the warmth building beneath it. The memory of her mother's hands smoothing clay into a wall felt close now, closer than it had in decades. Margaret whispered into the quiet room, "You taught me more than you knew." The storm would test her again, but this time she wasn't afraid of the night. She had turned memory into muscle, and the cold into something she could finally answer back. The weather radio crackled all night. Margaret had been half asleep when the warning came through, its mechanical voice sharp and urgent. Severe winter storm approaching, expected temperatures below zero, winds up to 40 miles per hour, travel strongly discouraged. She lay still, listening as the wind began to rise outside the shed. It sounded different than before, deeper, angrier, like something heavy being dragged across the sky. By morning, the world had disappeared. Snow pressed against the door in thick drifts. The small vent near the roof puffed out thin white breath as warm air escaped. Inside, the bricks around the stove still held heat from the night before. Margaret fed the fire slowly, the way she had learned. No rush, no panic. She set the kettle on top and wrapped herself in her blankets. Outside, the blizzard took over the town. On Maple Street, Daniel and Laura stood at their living room window, watching the snow whip sideways. The power had gone out before dawn. The furnace was silent. Laura pulled her sweater tighter. "This is worse than last year." Daniel checked his phone. No signal. The kids huddled under blankets on the couch. The house felt hollow without heat. "They said it might be days," Laura muttered. Daniel didn't answer right away. His mind was somewhere else. Behind the mechanic's shop in a crooked shed with brick walls and ducting. "She's out there," he said quietly. Laura looked at him. "Who?" "My mom." The words landed between them like dropped glass. Across town, Mr. Collins tried to keep his wood stove alive. He fed it until the metal glowed, but the heat rushed straight up the chimney and out into the storm. Frost crept along his windows anyway. At the hardware store, Evan watched his breath cloud in the air. His makeshift wall system was holding, but only barely. The wind found every weakness. By noon, the town felt trapped inside a snow globe. Margaret sat on her crate and listened to the storm batter the shed. The walls groaned under the pressure. Snow slipped through the smallest cracks and melted on the warm bricks. She placed her palm against the lining and felt the steady warmth beneath it. "Easy," she whispered, like she was calming a horse. The radio said temperatures had dropped to -10. By evening, they fell lower. At Daniel's house, Laura tried lighting candles. The kids complained about the cold. The pipes rattled and then went still. "We should go to the shelter," she said. Daniel shook his head. "Roads are closed." Laura hesitated. "Then, what about your mother?" He looked at her. "What about her?" Laura swallowed. "She's out there alone." Daniel grabbed his coat before she finished the sentence. They drove as far as they could, then had to walk. The wind tore at them like claws. Snow filled their boots. Laura slipped once and caught herself on a fence. "I can't believe she's still out here," Laura shouted over the wind. When they reached the shed, Daniel pounded on the door. Mom!" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. Warm air rushed into the frozen night like a confession. Margaret stood there with her shawl pulled tight and her face flushed from the heat. "Daniel," she said, "what are you doing out in this?" He stared past her, stunned. "You're warm." Laura stepped inside, shaking snow from her hair. The air wrapped around her like a blanket. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. Margaret closed the door and latched it. The wind vanished behind the walls. "I told you," Margaret said gently. "The heat stays now." Laura's eyes moved from the stove to the bricks to the ducting. "We don't even have power." "I don't need it," Margaret replied. They sat on crates and listened to the storm. Laura's hands trembled, not from cold, but from something heavier. "We thought," she began, then stopped. Margaret waited. "We thought you'd be the first to go," Laura admitted. Margaret nodded slowly. "So did I." Outside, the blizzard roared louder. At Mr. Collins' house, the fire went out. His fingers burned as he tried to relight it. The cold crept in fast. He pulled on his coat and stepped into the storm. The wind nearly knocked him over. He stumbled toward the back lot, following the faint curl of steam rising from the shed's vent. When he knocked, Margaret opened the door without surprise. "You look frozen," she said. Inside, he sank onto a crate and pressed his hands together. "How are you doing this?" he asked. "I'm not fighting the cold," she said. "I'm keeping what I make." Before midnight, Evan showed up. Then the young mother with 2 kids. Then the man with the cracked chimney. They didn't come all at once. They came in ones and twos, drawn by rumor and desperation. Margaret never turned anyone away. They sat shoulder to shoulder in the small space, wrapped in coats and blankets. The walls breathed out heat slowly, patiently. Someone said, "Feels like summer in here." Someone else laughed softly, half hysterical. Daniel watched his mother move among them, pouring water into cups, adjusting the stove, checking the ducting. She looked tired, but she looked strong. At his house, Laura's mind replayed the moment she had told Margaret to leave. She remembered standing in the kitchen, arms crossed, certain she was right. Now she sat on a crate in a shed that was warmer than her own living room. The storm howled through the night. In town, windows shattered from the cold. A transformer blew. Sirens wailed somewhere in the distance. Inside the shed, the kettle sang. Margaret fed the fire once before dawn. The bricks glowed faintly. The warmth rolled through the walls like a slow tide. The blizzard peaked just before sunrise. Snow buried the road signs. Drifts swallowed cars. The radio said it was the worst storm in 20 years. People huddled in Margaret's shed and waited. By afternoon, the wind eased. One by one, They stepped outside into a world that looked erased. Mr. Collins shook his head. If I hadn't come, he didn't finish the sentence. The young mother hugged Margaret. You saved us. Margaret shook her head. I just didn't waste what little I had. When Daniel and Laura walked back toward their house, Laura's eyes filled with tears. She should never have been out there alone, she said. Daniel nodded, no, but she wasn't. They reached their dark, cold home and stood on the porch. Laura turned to him. We did this. He didn't argue. That evening, Margaret stood in the doorway of the shed and watched the sun touch the snow. The storm had left scars everywhere. Broken branches, frozen pipes, empty streets. Inside, the bricks still held warmth. The storm had come for everyone, but it had not taken her. And the town would remember who stayed warm when the world froze. The storm didn't end all at once. It loosened its grip the way an old man releases a fist, slowly, grudgingly. By morning, the wind had dropped to a low, bitter whistle. Snow lay piled against houses like walls built overnight. The roads were still closed, the power still out in half the town, and the radio kept repeating the same phrase, remain indoors if possible. Margaret stood in the doorway of her shed and looked out at the quiet wreckage of winter. Broken branches lay across the lot. The mechanic's sign had tilted sideways. Everything felt paused, as if the town was holding its breath. Behind her, the little shelter was still warm. Mr. Collins stepped outside first, pulling his coat tight. He squinted at the sky. Never thought I'd be grateful to an old storage shed? Margaret smiled faintly. Neither did I. The young mother bundled her children and thanked Margaret again, her voice thick with emotion. Evan clapped Margaret lightly on the shoulder before trudging off through the snow. They didn't leave all at once. They left in ones and twos, walking carefully back toward homes that were still cold and dark. When the door finally closed, Margaret sat down on her crate and let out a long breath. The silence felt heavy after a night of shared warmth and whispered fear. She had never imagined this place would become a refuge. Across town, Daniel and Laura returned to their house, stepping inside the frozen rooms. Laura looked around as if seeing it for the first time. It feels empty, she said. Daniel didn't answer. He was thinking about the shed, about the way the warmth had spread from the walls instead of blasting from a single source. He thought about his mother's calm face in the middle of the storm. That afternoon, people began to talk. At the gas station, men stood around the counter with cups of coffee and nowhere to go. She kept it warm with scraps and clay, one said. No power, no furnace. Just bricks and patience. Someone shook his head. We laughed at her. The words landed awkwardly in the room. By evening, footsteps crunched through the snow toward Margaret's shed again. This time they came with questions. A man named Harold, whose furnace had cracked, knocked first. I heard you figured something out. Margaret invited him inside and showed him the bricks around the stove, the way the ducting ran along the base of the walls. It's not fancy, she said. It just slows the heat down. Harold frowned. So it stays longer? She nodded. Long enough to matter. The next day, Mrs. Patterson brought soup in a notebook. I want to write down what you're doing, she said. My cousin's pipes froze. He's got kids. Margaret hesitated. I'm not a teacher. You're a survivor, Mrs. Patterson replied. Same thing right now. By the third day after the storm, people were stopping by regularly. Not for shelter just yet, for guidance. Margaret showed them how she layered the walls, how she packed newspaper and cardboard, how she guided warm air instead of letting it rush out. She spoke slowly, choosing simple words. Heat is like water, she said once. If you let it run straight out, it's gone. If you make it wander, it stays. Word traveled beyond the block. A man from the edge of town came with his teenage son. A woman from the diner brought a friend whose heater had failed. They stood in the cramped shed and listened like students in a strange classroom. Margaret never charged them. When someone tried to hand her money, she shook her head. I don't sell what kept me alive. One afternoon, Laura stood at the edge of the lot and watched people come and go. She hadn't stepped inside the shed again since the storm. Margaret saw her from the doorway. You can come in, she said gently. Laura walked over slowly, her boots crunching in the snow. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her again. I didn't know, Laura said after a long pause. I didn't know you could do this. Margaret looked at her. I didn't either, until I had to. Laura's eyes filled. I thought you were fragile. Margaret nodded. I thought so too. They stood in silence. I was afraid, Laura admitted. Afraid of being responsible for you. Afraid of losing control of my own house. Margaret studied her face. Fear makes people build walls in the wrong places. Laura swallowed. I was wrong. Margaret didn't answer right away. Outside, someone knocked. Evan stood there with a coil of ducting in his arms. I tried what you showed me, he said. It worked. Not as good as yours, but better than before. Margaret smiled. That's how it starts. Soon the shed became a gathering point. Not loud, not crowded, but steady. Men and women sat on crates and took notes. Someone brought a chalkboard. Someone else brought extra bricks. Margaret moved among them, explaining, demonstrating, correcting. Her hands shook when she held the chalk. Not from cold, from the strange weight of being listened to. One night she sat alone after everyone had gone and stared at the walls. You always said I was too quiet, she whispered, thinking of Robert. Turns out, quiet learns things. Across town, Daniel watched his children sleep under piles of blankets. The power still hadn't returned. The furnace was silent. He thought of his mother sitting in a warm shed, surrounded by neighbors. Something inside him shifted. The next morning, he walked to her shelter with a bundle of boards on his shoulder. I want to build something like this, he said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. In your house? He nodded. If you'll help me. She studied him for a long moment. Then she smiled. I was hoping you'd ask. They worked together in the cold hallway of his house, lining the wall near the heater with bricks and ducting. Laura watched from the doorway, holding the kids close. When the heater came on, the warmth stayed. Not roaring, not rushing. Staying. Laura touched the wall and felt it hold the heat. She closed her eyes. That evening, she brought Margaret a plate of food and set it on the crate inside the shed. You don't have to stay out here forever, she said softly. Margaret looked around at the walls she had built, the system she had created, the people who now came to learn. I don't plan to, she replied, but I needed to know I could. The town slowly came back to life. Power lines were repaired, pipes thawed, roads were cleared. But the memory of the storm stayed. So did the memory of where people had gone when their homes failed them. The old shed behind the mechanic's shop was no longer just a shed. It was where the cold had been answered. And Margaret Hill, once sent away with a suitcase and a thin coat, had become something no one expected. Not a burden, a guide. A quiet kind of anchor in a winter that had tried to take everything. Winter didn't leave all at once. It loosened slowly, like a grip that didn't want to admit defeat. Snow still lined the streets, and the morning still came with a bite. But the worst of the storms had passed. What remained was something harder to measure. The change in the way people looked at Margaret Hill. The shed behind the mechanic's shop no longer felt hidden. Footprints led to it every day. Not desperate ones like during the blizzard, but curious ones. Margaret stood inside one afternoon, adjusting the bricks around the stove, when she heard voices outside. Is this where she did it? That's what they said. Two men from the next town over stepped inside, stamping snow from their boots. Ma'am, one of them said, awkwardly removing his hat. We heard you kept half your block warm when the power went out. Margaret blinked. I just kept myself warm. Others came. That's what we mean, the man replied. You didn't panic. She smiled faintly. I did. I just didn't let it run things. They stayed for nearly an hour, asking questions, sketching the walls in a notebook. When they left, one of them turned back. You should teach this somewhere proper, he said. Margaret laughed. This is proper enough, but the idea lingered. In the days that followed, people came not just with problems, but with plans. Someone brought real bricks. Someone else brought leftover insulation. Mrs. Patterson brought a folding table and declared it Margaret's desk. The shed began to look less like a shelter and more like a workshop. One evening, Margaret sat on her crate and watched Evan measure a wall for another neighbor. You've started something, he said. She shrugged. I just didn't want to freeze. That's how it always starts, he replied. Across town, Daniel and Laura felt the change too. At the grocery store, someone stopped Laura by the dairy case. Your mother-in-law's clever, the woman said. Wish I'd listened sooner. Laura forced a smile. At home, she sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall Daniel and Margaret had reinforced together. It was warmer now, not roaring heat, steady heat. Like a presence. She thought about the day she had told Margaret to leave, about the words we need our own life. She had meant comfort. She had gotten silence instead. That night, Laura said quietly, Maybe we should ask her to come back. Daniel looked up from his coffee. Not because of the cold. Laura shook her head. Because we were wrong. The next afternoon, Laura walked alone to the shed. Margaret was teaching a man how to seal ducting with clay. She looked up, surprised. You can come in, she said. Laura stepped inside and waited until the man left. I didn't come for lessons, she said. I came to talk. Margaret set down her tools. Laura's voice wavered. I thought if I pushed you out, everything would be simpler. But it got colder, in ways I didn't expect. Margaret studied her face. Cold has a way of showing you what you missed. Laura swallowed. We want you home. Not because you proved something, because you're family. Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked at the wall she had built, the system she had shaped, the place that had carried her through the worst nights of her life. I'll come, she said slowly, but not as someone who needs permission to stay. Laura nodded. As someone we should have listened to. They walked back together. The shed stayed. Daniel helped move Margaret's things that evening. The suitcase with the broken wheel, the kettle, the photo of Robert. When Margaret stepped back into the house on Maple Street, she felt something tighten in her chest. The walls looked the same. The furniture hadn't moved, but the space felt different, not owned, shared. Laura made dinner. The kids hugged Margaret hard enough to make her laugh. Daniel fixed the loose latch on the back door. And yet the shed still mattered. Every few days, Margaret walked back to it, meeting neighbors who still came with questions. She never locked the door. One morning, the local paper ran a short piece. Local woman's winter fix becomes town solution. They called her resourceful and unexpected. They said her idea had redefined cold weather survival. Margaret folded the paper and set it aside. Labels didn't matter much to her. What mattered was that no one laughed anymore. At the diner, people nodded when she walked in. Someone bought her coffee. Someone else asked if she could look at their drafty back room. She did. Slowly, quietly, the town adjusted. Not with big announcements, but with small changes. Bricks stacked near heaters. Ducting where there used to be open vents. Walls layered thicker than before. People stopped trying to burn their way through winter. They started thinking their way through it. One afternoon, Margaret stood in the shed with Mrs. Patterson and Evan, watching a group of teenagers take notes. Never thought kids would care about this stuff, Mrs. Patterson said. Margaret smiled. They care about staying warm. She thought about her own childhood, about her mother's hands smoothing clay into cracks, about nights when heat had been a gift, not an assumption. Everything useful comes back around, she said. At home, Laura began asking Margaret for advice. Not just about heat, about patience, about space, about how to live together without building the wrong walls. Margaret noticed the change. Laura didn't pace when she was angry anymore. She listened. One evening, they sat together in the living room while snow fell lightly outside. I was scared of losing control, Laura admitted. Scared of being trapped. Margaret nodded. So you pushed first. Laura met her eyes. I won't do that again. Margaret reached for her hand. Just don't forget what cold feels like. It keeps you honest. Spring began to show itself in small ways. Ice thinned on the sidewalks. Water ran in the gutters. The radio stopped talking about emergencies and went back to music. The shed behind the mechanic's shop stood quietly, its walls holding a little warmth even as the air softened. People still came by, but less often. Not because they forgot, because they learned. Margaret walked there one afternoon and stood in the doorway, feeling the faint heat still living in the bricks. She remembered the first night she had sat on the floor and prayed for a way. She remembered the sound of the wind trying to tear the place apart. She placed her hand on the wall. You kept your promise, she whispered. Back in the house, Laura set the table. Daniel fixed the window frame. The kids argued about homework. Normal sounds. Warm sounds. Margaret realized something then. The shed had given her proof. But the house had given her back a place. And the town had given her a voice she never asked for. Winter had taken her dignity and dared her to earn it back. She had done more than survive. She had changed the way people understood shelter. Not as something you defend with fire alone, but as something you shape with care. And as the last snow melted from the roads, Margaret Hill no longer felt like the woman who had been pushed out into the cold. She felt like someone who had walked through it and come back carrying heat. Spring didn't arrive with fireworks. It came quietly, the way healing usually does. Snow melted into thin rivers along the sidewalks. The air lost its bite and gained the smell of wet earth. People stopped talking about outages and started talking about gardens again. Margaret Hill noticed the change in small ways. Boots left by the door instead of heavy coats. Windows cracked open for fresh air. The radio no longer warning but singing. The shed behind the mechanic's shop still stood where it always had, its walls holding a faint memory of warmth. Margaret visited it once a week, sweeping the floor, checking the bricks, making sure the ducting stayed clear. Not because she needed it anymore, but because it had been part of her survival. It had been proof. One afternoon, she stood in the doorway and watched a young couple measure their own garage across the street. You think it'll work? The man asked his wife. She shrugged. It worked for Margaret. Margaret smiled to herself and walked home. On Maple Street, the house felt different than it had before winter. Not bigger, Not newer, but calmer. Laura no longer paced the kitchen. Daniel no longer avoided silence. The children no longer whispered when Margaret entered the room. They treated her space like something solid now, something earned. One evening, Laura sat with Margaret on the back porch while the kids chased fireflies. I still think about that day, Laura said. The day I told you to leave. Margaret didn't look away. So do I. I thought I was protecting my life, Laura said quietly. But I didn't see yours. Margaret nodded. Cold makes people narrow. Warmth lets them widen again. Laura laughed softly. You should write that down. Margaret shook her head. I lived it. The town changed too. Not in big dramatic ways, but in habits. People talked about heat differently now. They talked about keeping it instead of burning more. They talked about walls like they were part of the solution, not just something to decorate. At the hardware store, a small sign appeared near the insulation aisle. Ask about slow heat setups. Margaret pretended not to notice. At the diner, people waved her over to their booths. Someone always asked how the walls were doing. Someone else always said, you saved us that night. Margaret never corrected them. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who had been forced to remember what her mother once taught her. One Sunday, the local school invited her to speak to a class of 8th graders. She stood in front of them with a piece of chalk and drew a simple picture on the board. A stove, a wall, and a long, winding line between them. This line, she said, is time. If heat leaves too fast, you lose it. If it takes its time, you keep it. A boy raised his hand. So you tricked the cold? Margaret smiled. No, I just stopped fighting it the wrong way. Afterward, a teacher shook her hand. You turned fear into a lesson. Margaret walked home thinking about that. Fear into a lesson. She had never meant to teach anyone. She had only meant to survive. Late one afternoon, Margaret returned to the shed for the last time that season. The bricks were cool now. The ducting no longer breathed warmth, but the place still felt alive. She sat on the old crate and listened to the quiet. She remembered the night the storm had screamed outside and strangers had pressed close inside these walls. She remembered Daniel's face when he first stepped in and felt the heat. She remembered Laura's silence when she realized the woman she'd sent away had built something stronger than pride. Margaret stood and placed her hand against the wall. You did your job, she whispered. That night, she dreamed of her mother again. Not of cold, of hands smoothing clay, of firelight moving slowly through walls, of warmth staying where it was needed. Weeks later, the town held its annual spring picnic. Long tables were set up in the park. Kids ran with paper plates. Someone played guitar near the trees. Margaret sat between Daniel and Laura, holding a cup of lemonade. Evan walked over and pointed toward a row of houses. See those? 3 of them added slow heat walls this winter. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Already? He nodded. No one wants another storm like that. Laura leaned closer to Margaret. They still ask about you. Margaret laughed. They should ask about the walls. Laura smiled. They ask about the woman who built them first. Margaret watched the children run and felt something loosen in her chest. She had been afraid once. Afraid of being forgotten. Afraid of being useless. Afraid of being alone in the cold. Winter had tested her, but it had also introduced her to herself. Not as a burden, not as a problem, but as someone who could shape her own shelter. As the sun dipped low, Daniel stood and raised his cup. To my mom, he said awkwardly, who taught us how to stay warm. People laughed and clapped. Margaret waved him down, embarrassed. But inside, something steady settled. Later that night, she and Laura walked home together. Do you ever wish you hadn't gone through it? Laura asked. Margaret thought for a long moment. No, she said. I wish it hadn't hurt, but I don't wish it hadn't happened. Laura nodded, because it changed things. It showed them, Margaret replied, and it showed me. They reached the house and stepped inside. Warmth greeted them, not the loud kind, the kind that stays. Margaret sat by the window and watched the last light fade from the street. She thought about the woman she had been when she walked out with a suitcase and a thin coat. She thought about the woman she was now, and she wondered how many others had been pushed into the cold, by family, by age, by fear, and never been seen again. So let me ask you something. If you were forced out into winter with nothing but memory and stubborn hope, what would you build? Would you wait for warmth to be given to you? Or would you find a way to make it stay? Because sometimes the thing that saves you doesn't come from comfort. It comes from remembering who you were before the world decided you were done. Margaret Hill didn't defeat winter with fire. She defeated it with patience, with walls that held heat, and with the quiet belief that she was still worth shelter. If this story made you feel something, if it made you think about family, about survival, or about how we treat the people who grow old beside us, then maybe it's a story worth sharing. And maybe it's one worth staying for. So here's my question for you. What would you do if the door closed behind you in the middle of winter? Would you turn back or build forward? Tell us in the comments. And if you want more stories about people who were counted out but refused to disappear, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and stay with us for the next one. Because every winter hides a lesson, and every story hides a fire, if you know how to keep it.